Arrival with big dreams. Have you ever stood in a crowded place and suddenly felt invisible, not because people ignored you, but because you couldn't find the right words to exist? That was me on my first morning in the United States. I had crossed an ocean with a suitcase full of clothes, a head full of dreams, and an English level that could barely survive ordering coffee. I told myself this move would change my life. I just didn't know how uncomfortable that change would feel at the beginning. I arrived in America during early fall. The air was cool, dry, and strangely clean compared to where I came from. The sky felt wider, like it had more space to breathe. Everything looked familiar from movies, but nothing felt familiar inside my body. My brain was busy translating every sound. Every sentence I heard became a small puzzle. People talked fast, laughed easily, and moved like they knew exactly where they were going. I moved slower. I listened harder. I smiled a lot, hoping my smile could replace my missing words. You might think the hardest part was the language. Honestly, it wasn't. The hardest part was the feeling of being behind. Back home, I was confident. I knew how to explain myself. In America, I became quiet. When you can't speak well, you start to shrink. Not because you want to, but because your brain is trying to protect you. Psychologists call this language anxiety. Your nervous system thinks speaking a new language is danger. So it whispers, stay silent. Don't make mistakes. And silence slowly becomes a habit. On my first day, I practiced a simple sentence in my head again and again. Hi, nice to meet you. Just 6 words. Easy, right? But when I finally met my neighbor, the words came out stiff and shaky. My accent was heavy. My confidence was light. He smiled politely, replied with a long friendly sentence, and I understood almost nothing. I nodded like I understood everything. That nod became my survival skill in the first months. Here's something no one tells you about learning English in real life. Your brain gets tired before your mouth does. You listen all day. Your brain translates, guesses, panics, and fills in gaps. By evening, you're exhausted, not physically, but mentally. That's why many people quit practicing. Not because they are lazy, but because their brain is overwhelmed. When the brain is overwhelmed, motivation disappears first. That night, I lay in bed listening to the hum of traffic outside. In my home country, nights were quieter. Here, the sound never fully stopped. I stared at the ceiling and asked myself a dangerous question. What if I made a mistake coming here? It's a question many immigrants don't say out loud. But it sits quietly in the room, like an uninvited guest. Still, hope is a stubborn thing. The next morning, I woke up and did something small. I turned on the local radio. I didn't understand most of it, but I listened anyway. Not to learn every word, just to let my ears get used to the rhythm. This is something language scientists recommend, passive listening. Your brain learns patterns before meaning. You don't need to understand everything to improve. You just need to stay exposed. I started walking around my neighborhood every day. I looked at street signs, store names, posters, English everywhere, Simple and real. Not textbook English. Life English. I repeated words quietly to myself. Stop. Open. Closed. Sail. These words weren't fancy. But they were alive. They belonged to the world around me. One afternoon, I stood in a grocery store, staring at 20 different kinds of milk. Whole milk. Low fat. Almond milk. Soy milk. Back home. Milk was just milk. In that moment, I laughed at myself. Not because it was funny, but because it was human. Learning English in America wasn't just about grammar. It was about learning how people live, choose, and think. You might be watching this video right now feeling tired of trying. Tired of listening and not understanding. Tired of speaking and feeling small. I want you to know something important. Nothing is wrong with you. Your brain is doing its job, slowly, carefully, imperfectly. That's how real learning works. My big dream wasn't to speak perfect English. It was simpler. I wanted to belong. I wanted to walk into a room and not feel like I needed subtitles for life. And even though I didn't know it yet, every awkward smile, every quiet nod, every misunderstood sentence was already moving me forward. Failure didn't start with a job interview. It started earlier, with fear, silence, and self-doubt. But so did growth. And that's where this story truly begins. Climate shock in America. Have you ever stepped outside and felt like the weather was judging you personally? Not gently. Not politely. Just straight up saying, "You're not from here. Are you?" That was my second lesson in America, and it had nothing to do with grammar books or vocabulary apps. It was about climate. Real, physical, unavoidable climate, and how it quietly forced me to learn English whether I wanted to or not. Back home, seasons had manners. They arrived slowly, stayed predictable, and left without drama. In the US, especially where I lived, weather had personality. Fall felt like a short apology before winter slapped you awake. One morning, I walked outside wearing a light jacket, confident and optimistic. By afternoon, the wind cut through me like it had personal issues. My body learned new English words before my brain did. Cold, freezing, windy, lead. You don't truly learn a language until your comfort depends on it. At first, I didn't know how to talk about weather beyond hot and cold. But Americans talk about weather the way some people talk about feelings. It's small talk, yes, but it's also connection. At bus stops, in elevators, at grocery lines, someone would say, "Cold today, huh?" And that was an invitation. A tiny door opening. If you answered, you were human. If you didn't, you stayed invisible. The problem was, I often understood the words too late. My brain processed slowly, like an old computer running too many programs. By the time I figured out what someone said, the moment was gone. That delay hurt more than making mistakes. Because you don't feel stupid, you feel absent. Psychologically, this is called delayed processing in second language learners. Your brain is translating, filtering, predicting tone, and checking social rules all at once. It's exhausting. So again, Silence feels safer. But weather didn't care about my silence. Winter came anyway. Snow was beautiful on the first day. Quiet. Clean. Almost magical. By the fifth day, it was work. Shoveling sidewalks. Scraping car windows. Reading signs that said, "Snow emergency route." I had no idea what that meant. But it sounded serious. I looked it up, learned the phrase, and suddenly English wasn't abstract anymore. It was practical. Urgent. Useful. Here's something interesting. Studies show that we remember words better when they're tied to physical experience. That's why I still remember weather-related English so clearly. I didn't memorize those words. I lived them. My hands were cold. My shoes were wet. My frustration was real. One morning, I slipped on ice outside my apartment. Not a dramatic fall, just enough to embarrass myself deeply. A stranger rushed over and asked, "Are you okay?" I answered, "Yes. I'm fine." Too fast, too loud, like I'd rehearsed it my whole life. That sentence came out perfectly. Not because I was fluent, but because my brain had practiced it 100 times in fear. Fear is a powerful teacher. Not a kind one, but an effective one. As months passed, I noticed something strange. I started understanding weather conversations without translating. Someone said, "It's going to warm up this weekend," and my brain didn't panic. It just nodded internally. That's when I learned a quiet truth. Progress in language learning doesn't announce itself. It sneaks in when you're busy surviving. Climate also changed my daily rhythm. Shorter daylight in winter made evenings feel heavier. Lonelier. Motivation dropped. This wasn't just emotional, it was biological. Less sunlight affects mood, energy, and focus. Many immigrants experience this and blame themselves for losing motivation, when really, their body is adjusting. So I adapted. I listened to English podcasts while cooking. Nothing intense. Just voices in the background. I let English exist in my life without pressure. Neuroscientists call this low stress exposure, and it matters. When stress drops, learning improves. Spring arrived suddenly, like America decided to forgive me. Trees bloomed fast. People smiled more. Conversations felt lighter. I heard new words. Blooming, allergy season, finally. Weather shifted, and so did my confidence. I spoke more. Still slow. Still imperfect. But present. You see, climate taught me something language classes never did. Learning English isn't about controlling every sentence. It's about staying in the environment long enough for your brain to adapt. Just like your body adapts to cold or heat. Your mind adapts to language, if you stop fighting the discomfort. If you're listening to this and feeling stuck, ask yourself gently, are you trying to be perfect? Or are you trying to stay present? Because presence beats perfection, every single time. America didn't make learning English easy for me. But it made it unavoidable. And slowly, through cold mornings and awkward small talk, I stopped feeling like the weather was against me. It was just teaching me, quietly, patiently, one day at a time. My first job interview. Have you ever practiced something so many times in your head that it felt perfect, only to watch it fall apart the moment real life showed up? That was my first job interview in America. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just quietly devastating in the way only unmet expectations can be. I woke up that morning before my alarm. My brain refused to rest. It replayed sentences on a loop like a broken radio. I am very interested in this position. I have experience. I learn fast. Simple sentences. Safe sentences. The kind you memorize because they don't surprise you. I stood in front of the mirror and practiced smiling while speaking, because I'd read somewhere that Americans like confidence. What I didn't know was that confidence sounds different when you're not confident at all. The weather was strangely calm that day. No wind. No drama. Just a quiet sky that made me feel exposed. I wore my best clothes, the kind you save for important moments. On the bus, I listened to people talk around me. I didn't join. I conserved energy. When you're about to speak English under pressure, your brain behaves like it's about to run a marathon. It wants rest. Silence feels like stretching. The building was modern and cold, all glass and sharp lines. Inside, everything smelled like coffee and professionalism. A receptionist smiled and asked for my name. I answered clearly. That small success gave me a burst of hope. Maybe today would go better than I feared. Maybe all those nights listening, repeating, surviving, maybe they had prepared me more than I realized. Then I sat down. Waiting is its own kind of torture. My heart beat faster with every minute. I reviewed answers in my head, not just what to say, but how fast to say it. Too slow sounds unsure. Too fast sounds fake. This constant self-monitoring is common in second language speakers. Psychologists call it cognitive overload. Your brain isn't just answering questions, it's judging itself in real time. Finally, my name was called. The interviewer was friendly, smiling, relaxed. That should have helped. Instead, it made me nervous. Friendly English is harder than formal English. It moves fast. It bends rules. It hides meaning inside tone. He asked, so, tell me about yourself. A simple question. An open door. And I froze. Not completely. Words came out. But they were stiff, like they'd been stored too long in the freezer. I talked about my background, my skills, my motivation. I stuck to my memorized script. The problem with scripts is that real conversations don't follow them. When he interrupted with follow-up questions, my brain lagged. I understood pieces. I guessed the rest. Guessing is risky when your future is sitting across from you. At one point, he laughed lightly and said something I didn't catch. I laughed too, half a second late. That delay felt loud. It announced my confusion without words. From that moment on, I knew. Not logically, but physically. My shoulders tightened. My voice got thinner. My answers got shorter. This is where many people think failure happens because of poor English. That's only half true. The real issue is pressure. Under stress, your brain switches from learning mode to survival mode. Blood flow shifts. Memory access drops. Even native speakers perform worse when anxious. Add a second language, and it's like trying to think underwater. The interview ended politely. Handshake. Smile. We'll be in touch. That sentence sounded gentle, but it landed heavy. Outside, the air felt different. Too quiet. I walked without direction for a while, replaying everything. Every pause. Every missed word. Every moment I should have explained better, smiled less, spoken more. Failure doesn't scream. It whispers. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window and felt something sink inside me. It wasn't just disappointment. It was doubt. The dangerous kind. Maybe my English will never be good enough. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe effort isn't enough. If you've ever felt this after trying to speak English, you're not weak. You're human. Neuroscience shows that social rejection, or the fear of it, activates the same brain regions as physical pain. Your brain doesn't know the difference between being hurt and being embarrassed. It just knows it wants to avoid this feeling again. That night, I didn't study. I didn't listen to English. I avoided it completely. This is common after failure. Your brain tries to protect you by pulling away from the source of pain. The problem is, avoidance feels safe, but it quietly slows growth. I lay in bed thinking about one sentence the interviewer said near the end. I didn't understand it fully, but I remembered the tone. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dismissive. It was neutral. That realization mattered. My failure wasn't a judgment on my worth. It was feedback. Information. Raw and uncomfortable, but useful, if I chose to see it that way. At the time, I wasn't ready to see it clearly. All I felt was loss. Loss of confidence. Loss of momentum. Loss of the version of myself who believed effort guaranteed success. But sometimes, the first interview isn't meant to give you a job. It's meant to show you where the real work begins. The painful failure. Have you ever failed so quietly that no one noticed, except you? No dramatic rejection email. No harsh words. Just a polite silence that stretches longer than it should. That was how my first job interview failure in America settled into my life. Softly. Heavily. Like fog you don't see until you're already standing inside it. Days passed. Then weeks. No reply. No update. Each morning, I checked my email with a hope that felt thinner than the day before. Each evening, I told myself not to care. That lie didn't last long. Failure has a way of rearranging your inner furniture without asking permission. What surprised me most wasn't the disappointment. It was the shame. Not loud shame. Quiet shame. The kind that makes you rehearse imaginary conversations in the shower where you sound smarter, clearer, more American. The kind that makes you avoid telling people how things went, because you don't want to hear encouragement. Encouragement feels like pressure when you already feel small. I started replaying the interview in slow motion. This is called rumination, your brain's favorite useless hobby. Every pause became a mistake. Every misunderstood sentence became proof that I didn't belong. My accent suddenly felt heavier, like I was carrying it on my back. I caught myself thinking, if only my English were better, everything would be different. That thought sounds logical. It's also incomplete. Language wasn't the only thing I misunderstood. Culture was quietly working against me too. In my home country, job interviews were formal. You waited your turn. You answered carefully. In America, interviews are conversations disguised as evaluations. They want stories, not just facts. Confidence, not just correctness. I didn't know that yet. I thought accuracy mattered more than presence. Cultural psychologists talk about hidden rules, unspoken expectations everyone assumes you know. When you don't fail loudly. You fail subtly. And subtle failure hurts more, because you can't point to one clear reason. You just feel wrong. My motivation dropped fast after that. Not dramatically. Gradually. I still listen to English sometimes, but without curiosity. Without hope. When motivation disappears, the brain shifts into energy-saving mode. You do the minimum. You avoid risk. You stop raising your hand, even in your own life. I told myself I needed a break. That was partly true. Breaks are healthy. But what I really wanted was distance from the feeling of incompetence. English had become the symbol of that feeling. So I pushed it away. One afternoon, I sat in a cafe, watching people talk easily around me. Laughing. Interrupting. Being understood. Without effort. I wasn't jealous of their fluency. I was jealous of their ease. Their freedom to exist without translating themselves. That's when something clicked, not suddenly, but painfully. Slowly. My failure wasn't just about language skill. It was about identity. In learning English, I had lost my familiar self. The confident version of me didn't speak this language yet. And without that version, I felt unfinished. This identity gap is common in immigrants and language learners. You know who you are internally, but the outside world sees a reduced version. Fewer words. Simpler thoughts. Less humor. Over time, that gap can make you doubt your intelligence, even though intelligence was never the problem. I remember standing at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, thinking, what if I never catch up? It wasn't a dramatic thought. Just tired. That's how burnout sounds. Not angry. Just done. But here's the strange part about hitting that low point. Once you stop pretending you're fine, you create space for honesty. And honesty, while uncomfortable, is useful. I admitted something to myself that day. I hadn't failed because I was incapable. I had failed because I was new, in language, in culture, in myself. That reframing didn't magically restore my confidence. But it softened the edge of the pain. It turned failure from a verdict into a data point. A messy, emotional data point, but still information. I began paying attention differently. Not to perfect English, but to real English. The kind people use when they're not performing. I noticed how often Americans say I think instead of I know. How they value clarity over complexity. How interviews are less about right answers and more about connection. Failure had forced me to observe instead of perform. To listen without trying to impress. Ironically, that's when learning started again, quietly in the background. Without pressure. If you're listening to this and feeling like you've failed, an interview, a conversation, a test, I want you to hear this clearly. Failure doesn't mean stop. It means adjust. Your brain didn't shut down because you're weak. It pulled back because it needed safety. And safety doesn't come from avoiding English forever. It comes from returning to it gently. Without the weight of proving yourself. My first interview didn't give me a job. But it gave me something more important. A reason to change how I learned, how I listened, and how I treated myself. When I fell short, failure didn't end my story. It rewrote the rules. Self-doubt and silence. Have you ever noticed how silence doesn't arrive suddenly, it grows? One skipped conversation. One unanswered question. One moment where you choose nodding over speaking. After my failed interview, silence became my second language. Not because I wanted it, but because it felt safer than trying again. At first, I told myself I was just taking a break. That's the polite version. The honest version is this. I was afraid. Afraid of sounding stupid. Afraid of confirming what I secretly worried was true, that my English, and maybe even I myself, wasn't enough for this place. So I spoke less. I listened more. And slowly, invisibly, my world shrank. Silence is sneaky. It pretends to protect you. When you don't speak, you can't make mistakes. When you don't ask questions, no one sees your confusion. Your brain loves this illusion of safety. Neuroscientists say the brain prioritizes avoiding social pain over seeking growth. In simple terms, embarrassment hurts more than stagnation, at least in the short term. But silence has a cost. I remember standing in line at a pharmacy, needing help finding a product. The employee smiled and asked if I needed anything. I said, no, thank you, automatically, even though I absolutely did. Why? Because forming the question felt heavier than walking away confused. That moment wasn't about vocabulary. I knew the words. It was about confidence. Or rather, the lack of it. Self-doubt doesn't shout. It whispers questions that sound reasonable. What if they don't understand me? What if I say it wrong? What if I waste their time? These questions feel responsible. Polite. But they quietly teach you to disappear. Psychologists call this learned inhibition. After negative experiences, your brain links action with discomfort. So it reduces action. You stop volunteering opinions. You stop experimenting with language. You wait for perfect conditions that never arrive. At home, my English practice changed too. I still watched videos, but passively. No repeating. No speaking out loud. I told myself listening was enough. Listening felt productive without being risky. But language doesn't grow in silence. It grows in friction, gentle, manageable friction. The hardest part was watching my inner voice change. Back home, my thoughts were sharp, expressive, sometimes funny. In English, my thoughts felt flat, simplified. That gap made me feel smaller than I was. And over time, I started believing that smaller version was the real one. This is one of the most painful hidden effects of language learning. You don't just struggle to express yourself, you start doubting your own depth. Researchers call this identity reduction. When you can't fully express your personality, you temporarily lose access to it. One evening, I caught myself avoiding a phone call because it would be in English. That scared me. Not because of the call, but because avoidance had become automatic. I wasn't choosing silence anymore. Silence was choosing me. So I did something uncomfortable, but small. I made a rule for myself, 1 sentence a day. Not a conversation. Not a presentation. 1 sentence spoken out loud to another human being. Low pressure. High consistency. Scientists say habits stick better when they're tiny but regular. Your brain trusts repetition more than intensity. The first day, my sentence was awkward. The second day, it was shorter. The third day, it felt slightly easier. Not confident, just survivable. And that was enough. I also started naming my self-doubt instead of obeying it. When my brain said, "Don't speak, you'll mess up," I responded internally, "Thanks for trying to protect me, but I'm allowed to practice." This technique comes from cognitive behavioral therapy. You don't fight the thought. You acknowledge it, and move anyway. Something unexpected happened as I slowly re-entered English. People were kinder than my fear predicted. They waited. They clarified. Some even thanked me for trying. My brain had exaggerated the danger. It had been using old data from one bad interview to predict every future interaction. That's the problem with self-doubt. It generalizes. One failure becomes a rule. Silence becomes a habit. And habits, once formed, feel like personality. But they're not. If you're listening to this and you've gone quiet, not just in English, but in confidence, I want you to know this. Silence doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're tired. It means your brain has been working overtime to protect you. The way out isn't forcing yourself to be brave all at once. It's choosing small acts of presence. 1 sentence. 1 question. 1 moment of imperfect courage. I didn't regain my voice overnight. But I stopped losing it. And that, quietly, slowly, changed everything. Love appears quietly. Have you ever noticed that the most important changes in life don't announce themselves? They don't knock loudly or demand attention. They slip in while you're busy surviving. That's how love entered my life in America, quietly, almost politely, at a time when I wasn't looking for anything except stability. After weeks of silence and self-doubt, my world had become small and controlled. Same routes. Same routines. Same safe English phrases. I didn't want surprises. Surprises required words I didn't trust myself to use. And then, without warning, I met someone who didn't ask me to be fluent, only present. We met through ordinary life. No romantic movie scene. Just shared space, repeated encounters, and small talk that slowly stopped feeling small. At first, our conversations were simple. Weather, work, daily routines. My English was slow. Hers was patient. That patience mattered more than perfect grammar ever could. When you speak a second language, you're not just translating words, you're translating yourself. That takes courage. And when someone listens without rushing you, your nervous system relaxes. Scientists call this psychological safety. When you feel safe, your brain exits survival mode and enters learning mode. Vocabulary sticks better. Sentences come faster. You breathe differently. I didn't realize it at the time, but love was changing how I learned English. With her, mistakes weren't failures. They were moments. Sometimes funny. Sometimes confusing. Sometimes tender. I misused words. I mixed tenses. I paused mid-sentence searching for meaning. She waited. Sometimes she helped. Sometimes she just listened. And slowly, I stopped apologizing for my English every time I spoke. That was new. I noticed my voice sounded different around her. Softer. Less defensive. When you're not afraid of judgment, your tone changes naturally. This isn't poetic, it's neurological. Fear tightens muscles. Safety loosens them. Your speech literally flows better when you're calm. Our conversations became my favorite English practice. Not because they were educational, but because they were real. We talked about family, values, childhood memories. I had to stretch my language to explain who I was, not just what I needed. That stretch was uncomfortable, but meaningful. Here's something most language courses don't teach. Emotional relevance accelerates learning. When words matter emotionally, your brain prioritizes them. I didn't memorize phrases about love or relationships. I learned them because I needed them. Because silence wasn't an option anymore. There were moments of misunderstanding, of course. Cultural ones. Emotional ones. Sometimes my words sounded colder than I intended. Sometimes I misunderstood jokes or indirect meanings. Instead of shutting down, we talked about it. Slowly. Carefully. Those conversations taught me more about American communication than any textbook ever did. In American culture, expressing feelings openly is often encouraged. Directness is valued. That was new for me. Back home, emotions were implied, not stated. Learning to say, I feel, instead of I think felt strange at first. But it also felt freeing. English gave me permission to be clearer with my emotions. Love also challenged my old habit of silence. You can't build intimacy by nodding. At some point, you have to speak, even imperfectly. That pressure wasn't heavy. It was gentle. But it was consistent. And consistency builds confidence. I started noticing something else. My motivation to improve English wasn't coming from fear anymore. It was coming from connection. I wanted to understand her better. I wanted to be understood. That shift changed everything. Fear-based motivation burns fast and disappears. Connection-based motivation lasts. Psychologists talk about intrinsic motivation, the kind that comes from meaning, not obligation. Love created meaning. English stopped being a test I kept failing and became a bridge I was slowly building. There was a moment I remember clearly. We were talking late one evening, and I told a story about my past. Not perfectly, not fluently, but honestly. When I finished, there was a pause. Not an awkward one. A full one. She smiled and said she understood. Fully. That moment rewired something in me. I realized I didn't need perfect English to be fully seen. I needed courage, patience, and someone willing to meet me halfway. That realization didn't just change how I spoke, it changed how I saw myself. If you're learning English and feeling alone, here's something I wish someone had told me earlier. Language grows faster in connection than in isolation. You don't need romance to experience this. You need safety. You need at least one space where mistakes don't equal judgment. Love didn't solve my problems. It didn't magically make interviews easier or accents disappear. But it softened the world. And when the world feels softer, you risk more. You speak more. You live more. Looking back, love didn't arrive to save me. It arrived to remind me that my voice was worth hearing, even before it was perfect. Learning English through life. Have you ever realized you were learning something only after it had already changed you? Not in a classroom. Not from a plan. Just quietly. In the background, while life kept happening. That's how English finally started to settle into me, not as a subject, but as a part of daily life. By this point, I had stopped chasing fluency like a finish line. I wasn't trying to sound American anymore. I was trying to live. And strangely, that's when my English improved the most. Not faster, just deeper. More natural. Less forced. Learning through life feels inefficient at first. There's no schedule. No clear progress bar. But your brain loves context. It remembers words better when they arrive with emotion, movement, and purpose. That's neuroscience, not motivation talk. When learning connects to survival or meaning, your memory systems light up. I learned English while cooking dinner. Recipes taught me verbs, chop, stir, simmer. I learned English while arguing gently about where to go on weekends. That taught me phrases like how about, and I don't mind. These weren't textbook sentences. They were decisions. Preferences. Small pieces of identity. At the grocery store, I stopped just reading labels. I started listening. How people asked for help. How they complained politely. How they joked with cashiers. American English is full of softeners, kind of, maybe, a bit. These words don't change meaning much, but they change tone completely. Learning them helped me sound less sharp without trying to be nicer than I was. One of the biggest shifts happened at home. English stopped being practice time and became background sound. News playing while cleaning. Podcasts during walks. Not for full understanding, just exposure. Linguists call this comprehensible input plus tolerance for ambiguity. In simple words, you don't need to understand everything. You need to stay relaxed enough to keep listening. Something unexpected happened when I lowered the pressure. My listening improved. My speaking followed. When your brain isn't busy panicking about mistakes, it can actually process language. Stress blocks learning. Calm opens it. There were still misunderstandings. Plenty of them. But they didn't stop me anymore. They became part of the rhythm. I learned to say, "Can you say that again?" without apology. I learned that Americans appreciate honesty more than pretending. That sentence alone saved me hundreds of nods. I also learned something important about pronunciation. Perfection doesn't equal clarity. Rhythm does. Stress does. I focused less on sounding right and more on being understood. That meant slowing down, pausing, letting sentences breathe. Ironically, slowing down made people understand me faster. Life also forced me to learn emotional English. Words for feelings, boundaries, disagreements. These are harder than nouns or verbs. They require vulnerability. Saying, "I'm tired," or "that hurt," in a second language feels risky. But those sentences brought me closer to people, and closer to myself. Psychologically, this stage of learning is called integration. Language stops being external and starts becoming internal. You don't translate as much. You think in fragments. You dream in mixed languages. It's messy. But it means your brain is building shortcuts. I noticed my inner voice changing again. This time, not shrinking, but expanding. I could joke. I could disagree. I could explain a story without rehearsing. That didn't make me fluent. It made me functional. And functional is powerful. If you're listening and wondering why formal study isn't working, ask yourself this: is English living in your life, or is it visiting occasionally? Language grows where it's needed. Invite it into daily routines. Let it sit quietly in the room with you. You don't need more rules. You need more moments. I didn't learn English. I lived into it. Slowly. Imperfectly. Honestly. And for the first time since arriving in America, English didn't feel like a test. It felt like home. American culture lessons. Imagine following every visible rule and still feeling like you're standing slightly out of frame, like the camera never quite centers on you. That quiet discomfort doesn't come from grammar mistakes. It comes from culture, the invisible system that decides what sounds normal, confident, or strange long before words finish forming in your mouth. By the time I reached this stage of my life in America, my English was no longer completely fragile. I could communicate. I could survive conversations. But something still felt off. I often walked away from interactions wondering why they felt flat, why people reacted differently than I expected, why silence sometimes worked against me instead of protecting me. Culture was the missing layer. At first, I thought culture meant food, holidays, and accents. Those are the visible parts. Real culture lives underneath, inside assumptions. In the US, people value clarity more than subtlety. Back home, being indirect was polite. In America, being indirect can sound unsure, unprepared, or even dishonest. That realization hit me slowly and painfully. I noticed it in small moments. Someone would ask for my opinion, and I'd answer carefully, softly, leaving space for others. That felt respectful to me. But the response I often got was a polite nod and a quick move on. Later, someone else would speak up confidently, sometimes with less information, and their voice carried weight. That confused me. Until I understood, in American culture, speaking clearly signals engagement, not arrogance. This difference changed how I approached English. It wasn't just about choosing the right words. It was about choosing to be visible. Psychologists call this cultural mismatch stress. Your brain is fluent enough to speak, but not fluent enough to read expectations. That gap creates constant low-level anxiety. You're not relaxed. Because you're always checking, is this too direct? Too quiet? Too emotional? That mental multitasking drains energy fast. Work culture taught me the sharpest lessons. Titles mattered less than ideas. People questioned managers openly. Disagreement wasn't conflict, it was participation. Silence, on the other hand, was often read as lack of interest. That terrified me. Silence had been my shield for so long. Now it was working against me. So I learned a powerful sentence. I'm not sure, but here's what I think. That sentence did something incredible. It allowed me to speak without pretending to be confident. It respected honesty and clarity at the same time. Americans responded well to that. Not because my English was perfect, but because my intent was clear. Social culture surprised me too. When Americans say, "How are you?" they're often not asking for your life story. They're opening a door, not walking through it. Understanding that saved me from embarrassment, and from feeling rejected when deep answers weren't welcomed. Once I learned the rhythm, interactions felt lighter. Romantic and personal relationships added another layer. In American culture, boundaries are spoken. You don't wait for people to guess. Saying, "I'm uncomfortable with that," or "I need time," isn't rude, it's respectful. At first, that directness felt cold to me. Over time, it felt safe. Clear language reduced misunderstandings. Reduced misunderstandings, reduced emotional exhaustion. Even policies and systems taught me cultural English. Forms were direct. Instructions were explicit. The expectation was simple: read, ask questions, follow through. Asking questions wasn't seen as incompetence. It was seen as responsibility. That mindset changed how I learned. Confusion stopped being shameful. It became a signal to engage. One of the biggest shifts happened when I stopped trying to sound American and started trying to understand Americans. Copying behavior created tension. Understanding patterns created freedom. I could choose when to adapt and when to stay myself. My English didn't suddenly improve overnight. But my confidence did. And confidence changes how language lands. People listened differently. Conversations felt more balanced. I wasn't shrinking anymore. If you're learning English and still feel out of place, consider this. You might not be missing vocabulary. You might be missing cultural permission to speak the way you already can. Pay attention to what's rewarded. Clarity. Presence. Honesty. These are cultural signals as much as linguistic ones. America didn't just teach me how to speak English. It taught me how to stand in a conversation without fading into the background. Marriage and responsibility. Marriage doesn't arrive with fireworks when you're building a life in a second language. It arrives with paperwork, quiet decisions, and the sudden realization that your words now carry weight beyond yourself. By the time I got married in the United States, English was no longer just a skill I was trying to improve. It had become the main tool I used to protect, explain, and sometimes repair the life we were building together. Responsibility changes the way you speak. When your words affect another person's comfort, safety, and future, you stop treating language like a performance. You start treating it like infrastructure. Something that has to work, even when it's not pretty. Marriage in America surprised me. Not because of romance, but because of communication. Decisions were discussed out loud. Expectations were named. Feelings were explained instead of implied. Back home, many things were understood without being said. Here, understanding was something you actively built, sentence by sentence. At first, this felt exhausting. Explaining yourself in a second language already costs energy. Explaining emotions costs even more. I often searched for the right words, while the feeling moved faster than my mouth. That gap created tension. Not conflict, confusion. And confusion, if ignored, quietly turns into distance. I learned quickly that silence doesn't mean peace in a marriage. It often means postponement. Unspoken issues don't disappear. They wait. And when English is your second language, it's tempting to delay difficult conversations until you say it better. The problem is, better rarely comes on its own. So I started speaking sooner. Not more fluently, just sooner. There's a psychological reason this helped. When you speak before emotions pile up, your brain stays calmer. Calm brains access vocabulary better. Angry or anxious brains shut it down. Marriage forced me to practice emotional timing, not just emotional accuracy. Money conversations were another test. Budgets, bills, future plans. These topics don't care about your accent. They demand clarity. I learned financial English the hard way, through real consequences. Words like insurance, deductible, credit score weren't abstract anymore. They were daily realities. Responsibility accelerated my learning, because misunderstanding was no longer an option. American marriage culture also places value on partnership. Decisions are shared. Opinions are expected. What do you think? Isn't a polite question, it's a real one. At first, I answered carefully, minimizing my needs to avoid mistakes. Over time, I realized something important, being unclear to avoid. Conflict creates more conflict later. That realization changed how I used English. I practiced saying simple, honest sentences. I need help. I'm not comfortable with that. I don't understand. Yet. These sentences aren't advanced. But they require courage. And courage, like language, grows with repetition. There were moments I failed. Moments where my words sounded harsher than I intended. Moments where I misunderstood tone and reacted defensively. Marriage doesn't forgive language mistakes automatically, but it does provide feedback quickly. That feedback, while uncomfortable, was invaluable. I started noticing patterns. When I slowed down and used fewer words, communication improved. When I focused on clarity instead of sounding smart, misunderstandings decreased. When I admitted confusion instead of hiding it, trust increased. These lessons weren't about English. They were about responsibility. Responsibility also changed my motivation. I wasn't learning English to prove myself anymore. I was learning to show up. To be reliable. To be emotionally present. That kind of motivation doesn't burn out easily. It deepens. There's a concept in psychology called role-based learning. When your role changes, partner, spouse, caregiver, your brain adapts quickly to meet new demands. Marriage activated that mechanism for me. English became part of my role, not my identity struggle. If you're learning English and entering a serious relationship, know this. You don't need perfect language to be a good partner. You need honesty, consistency, and the willingness to repair misunderstandings. Language improves when it's used for care, not comparison. Marriage didn't fix my English. It gave it purpose. And purpose, more than any app or class, taught me how to speak when it mattered most. Raising a family abroad. Raising a family in a foreign country doesn't feel heroic. It feels repetitive, noisy, and slightly overwhelming, especially when the language you use to guide, protect, and comfort your children isn't the one you grew up with. By the time our family life settled into a rhythm in America, English had fully stepped out of the classroom and into every corner of our home. Children don't wait for your language confidence to catch up. They ask questions fast. They need answers now. They test boundaries without translation. That pressure changed how I learned English more than any exam ever could. When language becomes necessary for care, your brain stops negotiating. It adapts. I learned English through bedtime routines. Stories read slowly. Questions asked unexpectedly. Words repeated until meaning landed. Reading children's books taught me something adult materials never did. Simple structure. Clear rhythm. Emotional clarity. These books weren't childish. They were efficient. They showed me how English works when it's meant to be understood, not admired. School life added another layer. Forms. Emails. Meetings. Conversations with teachers. American schools communicate often and directly. Missing information has consequences. I couldn't rely on guessing anymore. I had to ask. I had to clarify. And I had to do it calmly, even when I felt insecure. Parenting in English forced me to develop a new kind of confidence. Not loud. Not performative. Functional. I didn't need to sound fluent. I needed to sound responsible. That distinction mattered. Responsibility forgives accents. It doesn't forgive silence. At home, English mixed with our native language. Sentences blended. Grammar bent. At first, I worried this would confuse our children. Research says the opposite. Multilingual environments strengthen cognitive flexibility. Kids learn context faster than rules. Watching them switch effortlessly reminded me that language is less fragile than adults think. Children also mirror how you treat language. When I laughed at my mistakes, they laughed with me. When I apologized too much, they hesitated. That realization was humbling. My relationship with English was teaching them how to relate to uncertainty itself. Emotional English became crucial. Comforting a child in pain requires the right tone more than perfect words. It's okay doesn't need elegance. It needs presence. Over time, I learned that warmth travels faster than grammar. My accent didn't matter when my intention was clear. There were hard days. Parent-teacher meetings where my brain lagged. Medical appointments filled with unfamiliar terms. Emergency situations where clarity mattered immediately. Those moments were stressful, but they accelerated learning. Stress paired with purpose creates strong memory. Not pleasant, but effective. Family life also changed my listening skills. Children speak in fragments. They interrupt. They jump topics. Understanding them trained my brain to handle imperfect input. That skill transferred everywhere else. Conversations felt easier. Noise felt manageable. One unexpected gift of raising a family abroad was perspective. My children belonged naturally. They didn't carry the same fear. Watching them navigate English freely softened my self-judgment. Language wasn't something to earn. It was something to use. If you're learning English while raising a family, remember this: you are already practicing in the most powerful classroom possible. Daily life. Real stakes. Real love. Progress may feel slow, but it's deep. Family didn't make my English perfect. It made it necessary. And necessity, when paired with care, quietly builds confidence that lasts. Failure becomes a teacher. Failure changes shape when you stop running from it. What once felt like a wall slowly turns into a mirror, then, if you stay long enough, a map. By the time I reached this stage of my life in America, that first failed job interview no longer hurt the way it used to. It had transformed into something quieter, heavier, and far more useful. At first, failure felt personal. Like a judgment on my intelligence, my accent, my worth. That's the default reaction. The brain prefers simple explanations, and self-blame is painfully simple. But over time, distance softened the edges. I started seeing patterns instead of wounds. The interview wasn't a single event. It was a snapshot of who I was then. New. Tense. Over-rehearsed. Afraid of taking space. Failure wasn't saying, you can't. It was saying, this version of you isn't ready yet. That distinction matters. Psychologists talk about attribution, how we explain success and failure to ourselves. When failure is attributed to identity, I'm bad at English, motivation collapses. When it's attributed to strategy or timing, I approach this wrong. Learning opens up. Without knowing the theory, I felt the shift happening inside me. I began revisiting that interview in a different way. Not emotionally, analytically. I noticed how scripted I sounded. How little I asked back. How carefully I tried not to interrupt. None of those were language errors. They were adaptation errors. I had brought the communication rules of my old world into a new one without realizing it. Once I saw that, something unlocked. Failure wasn't proof of limitation. It was feedback from an unfamiliar system. I started experimenting. Not recklessly, intentionally. In conversations, I practiced stating opinions earlier instead of waiting. I asked clarifying questions instead of guessing. I allowed myself to speak before my sentences were perfect. Every small risk rewired my brain's relationship with English. Neuroscience supports this. The brain learns best when mistakes are followed by reflection, not punishment. When you fail and stay engaged, neural pathways strengthen. When you fail and withdraw, they weaken. My earlier silence had slowed learning. My later curiosity accelerated it. I also noticed something surprising. Americans responded more positively when I acknowledged imperfection openly. Saying, "I'm still learning, but here's what I think," invited collaboration instead of judgment. That sentence carried confidence, not because it was flawless, but because it was honest. Failure had taught me how to frame myself. Another lesson failure offered was patience. Real progress doesn't follow motivation. It follows consistency. The weeks where I felt nothing changing were still working on me quietly. Language acquisition isn't dramatic. It's cumulative. Like interest compounding invisibly until one day you notice the total. Looking back, I realized how many times I almost quit, not learning English entirely, but learning it seriously. Settling into survival mode. Accepting good enough because improvement felt tiring. Failure could have locked me there. Instead, it nudged me forward by refusing to be ignored. I stopped asking, "Why did I fail?" and started asking, "What did this reveal?" That question changed everything. It shifted my focus from emotion to information. From shame to strategy. I learned that interviews in America are conversations, not interrogations. That confidence doesn't mean certainty. That clarity matters more than complexity. These lessons didn't come from success. They came from the space failure forced me to examine. If you're learning English and carrying a failure with you, a bad conversation, a missed opportunity, an embarrassing moment, don't rush to erase it. Sit with it long enough to learn its language. Failure speaks quietly, precisely. It tells you where to adjust, not where to stop. Failure also taught me compassion. Toward myself. Toward others learning something new. I became less impressed by fluency and more impressed by effort. Less judgmental of pauses. More patient with accents. That shift didn't just make me a better learner. It made me a better human. In the end, that first interview failure did something no success could have done. It forced me to grow consciously. It taught me how to learn, not just what to learn. And once failure becomes a teacher, it stops being something you fear. It becomes something you listen to. Learning to stay. The room was quiet that evening. Not the empty kind of quiet. It was the kind that feels full, like something important is sitting beside you, waiting. I was sitting by the window. Again. The same chair. The same view. But I was not the same person. Outside, the sky was turning soft orange and pale blue. Cars passed by slowly. Someone laughed in the distance. Life was happening gently, without asking for permission. For a long time, I believed that peace would come later. After more success. After more money. After fixing myself completely. But that night, something simple became clear. Peace does not arrive when everything is perfect. It appears when you stop running. I placed my hands on my knees and took a slow breath. Not a deep breath. Just a real one. My chest rose. Then fell. For the first time in a long while, I stayed with the feeling instead of escaping it. There was still fear. There was still doubt. But they were quieter. Now, like voices in another room. In the past, silence made me uncomfortable. Silence forced me to hear my own thoughts. And some of those thoughts were heavy. So I stayed busy. Always moving. Always planning. Always chasing something ahead. Stillness felt dangerous back then. That evening, stillness felt different. It felt honest. I noticed small things. The sound of my breathing. The weight of my body against the chair. The faint smell of tea on the table. Nothing special. Yet everything mattered. Staying does not mean giving up. It means stopping the habit of leaving yourself behind. For years, I left myself whenever things became uncomfortable. I escaped into work. Into noise. Into other people's expectations. I thought leaving was strength. I thought endurance meant pushing harder. But true strength appeared in a quieter form. It appeared as staying. Staying with sadness instead of hiding it. Staying with confusion instead of rushing for answers. Staying with joy instead of waiting for it to disappear. That night, memories came and went. Some were warm. Some still hurt. I did not push them away. I let them pass, like clouds crossing the sky. Each memory taught something. Not everything needs a reaction. Not every feeling needs to be solved. Some feelings only ask to be seen. I remembered the version of myself who tried so hard to be strong. The one who smiled even when tired. The one who said, "I'm fine," too quickly. That version was not weak. That version was doing the best they could with what they knew. I felt compassion rise. Not pity. Understanding. Growth does not come from judgment. It comes from gentleness. People often say, "Be stronger." Few people say, "Be kinder to yourself." Yet kindness is what allows strength. To grow. The sky outside darkened slowly. Street lights turned on one by one. Time moved forward, but I was no longer chasing it. Staying taught me something important. You do not need to fix yourself to be worthy of rest. You do not need permission to pause. Rest is not a reward. It is a need. I stood up and stretched my arms. My body felt tired, but lighter. The world had not changed. My responsibilities were still there. Tomorrow would still come. But my relationship with the moment had changed. I did not feel lost anymore. I felt present. Presence is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply feels like being where you are, fully. Before going to bed, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. I am allowed to stay. Those words were not dramatic. They were not inspirational quotes. They were a promise. A promise to stop abandoning myself when things get hard. A promise to listen instead of run. A promise to stay. Learning a language is like this too. Progress does not come from rushing through words. It comes from staying with them. Repeating them. Feeling their rhythm. Understanding grows when patience is present. Just like life. Each sentence you read. Each word you repeat. Each pause you allow. They all matter. You are not behind. You are not late. You are here. And staying right here is enough for now. Take a slow breath. Let the moment sit with you. There is nothing else you need to do. When this story began, nothing dramatic happened. No big moment. No loud change. Just small thoughts. Quiet days. Ordinary feelings. And maybe that is the point. Life does not always change with a loud sound. Sometimes, it changes when we finally slow down enough to notice ourselves. Throughout this journey, you heard many moments. Moments of doubt. Moments of waiting. Moments of choosing to stay instead of run. None of them were perfect. None of them needed to be. Because growth is rarely a straight line. It is a series of pauses. Each pause teaches something different. Not about success. Not about being better than others. But about being more honest with yourself. There was fear in this story. There was loneliness. There was uncertainty. Yet none of those feelings were the enemy. They were messengers. They appeared not to hurt, but to guide. To slow the pace. To ask better questions. Questions like, what are you running from? What are you waiting for? What part of yourself have you been leaving behind? These questions do not need fast answers. They need space. And maybe that is why you are here. Listening. Reading. Repeating these words. Language learning is not just about vocabulary. It is about learning to sit with uncertainty. To accept mistakes. To move forward gently. Just like life. Each word you understood today is a small victory. Each sentence you repeated is proof of patience. Each moment you stayed, even when it felt slow, matters. Many people think progress should feel exciting. But real progress often feels quiet. It feels like understanding one sentence more than yesterday. It feels like breathing a little easier. It feels like no longer rushing to become someone else. At the end of this video, nothing is demanded from you. No challenge. No promise. Only an invitation. An invitation to carry this calm into your next moment. Into your next conversation. Into the way you speak to yourself. You do not need to remember everything. You only need to remember one thing. You are allowed to learn slowly. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to stay. And if these words felt familiar, if they felt like they were talking to a part of you that rarely speaks, then maybe this is not the end. Maybe it is the beginning of a quieter habit. A habit of listening. Of returning. Of choosing presence over pressure. So when the video ends, and the sound fades, pay attention to what remains. Because sometimes, what stays after the silence is exactly what you needed to hear.